I feel like there are so many people that dramatically underestimate the importance of their hip health.
Introducing the Paramena Bliss Podcast, a show dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of achieving optimal health naturally as you transition into perimenopause and menopause. Get ready to join your host, Dr. Seth Yates, an experienced naturopathic doctor, acupuncturist, and kinesiologist, as he shares his wealth of knowledge acquired from over 40,000 patient visits and 15 years in working with perimenopausal females. Welcome to the Paramena Bliss Podcast.
Hey, this is Doc Yates. Welcome to Perimeno Bliss, brought to you by perimenobliss.com, ablehealth.us, and today we are talking about how it is all in the hips. There are so many issues that I treat on a regular basis that people could prevent or even treat on their own if they were putting a lot more time into their hip health. It is all in the hips. And I feel like it's probably something that's just been getting worse over the years because as our jobs become more stagnant, stationary, locked into a chair, sitting on our butts all day, that it just leads to that many more issues where people are just lacking a lot of strength in their hips and a lot of flexibility in their hips. And it's one of those things where, unfortunately, you can go to a chiropractor, you can go to an osteopath, you can go to an acupuncturist, kinesiologist, even a physiotherapist, but because the nature of these jobs where you're just sitting all day, you need to do something on a more regular basis to get the benefits that you want, which means you have to be able to do these things on your own, at your home, as part of your own kind of health routine. You have to build it into your exercise program. So we're going to talk about 4 things that I treat on a regular basis that are very commonly linked to hip issues, and hip alignment is a big part of it. So hip alignment, but it still ties back into some parts of your hips are too weak, some parts are too tight, and it's pulling everything out of alignment and leading to issues. So, number 1, the most obvious of all, linked to hip issues is low back pain and SI joint pain, because a lot of times people aren't sure what that means. But when you get low back pain and it's at the very bottom of your back and it's just kind of off to the side a little bit, about 2 to 3 inches or so, kind of from the center of your spine, that's your SI joints. And when your hips are out of alignment, that is the joint that seems to take a lot of the strain and have most of the discomfort. And that pain can radiate to the front of the hip. It can radiate around the side of the hip. It can radiate up the back. So because the way the back muscles work is they start at the bottom and they work their way up, that pain can radiate through any of those directions, and it still ties back into hip issues, working on the hips. And don't worry, I'm going to get into a few things you can start doing on your own and suggestions for getting your hips worked on. But yeah, low back pain and SI joint pain, almost always linked with a hip alignment issue. Almost always. Number 2 is sciatic pain. Very, very commonly is sciatic pain linked with a hip alignment issue, because what happens is that as the glute muscle becomes weak, the piriformis tightens up to compensate, and it can pinch down on the sciatic nerve. Or if there's an alignment issue with your hip, and if your hip is kind of pulling forward or backwards, that will put some pressure right up around L5, S1, and that can cause an impingement that can lead to sciatic pain. So you need to work with the hips. The other thing too is that when you lack that flexibility through your hips, you end up doing a lot more bending from the back, which puts that much more strain on the back, which can lead to impingement of these nerves. So sciatic pain is number 2, linked with hip pain. Number 3, knee pain. Especially if it's knee pain that goes down along the outside of your knee. I found that even more so the case. If it travels down what they call the IT band, even if you get so that it's like a runner's knee where you're seeing a swelling along the outside of the knee, and it's probably because of something called bursitis, but But that bursitis is because the muscles are too tight rubbing in that area, and they're too tight rubbing in that area because it's pulling from the hips. I know you walk on your feet all day, but the biggest muscle in your body is around stabilizing your hips. So really the foundation is actually from that stabilization. Think of it as kind of like those bridges, those cable suspension bridges, where the stabilizing comes from above, not just below. Okay, so your hip is the big muscle, it is the foundation, it is the anchor. And when it's off, it pulls everything else out with it. So if you're having problems with knee pain, especially one-sided knee pain where you know you didn't do anything to tweak it, twist it, damage that knee, it's just been feeling tight and pulling off, don't just work on the knee, work on the hips. And this goes for anyone who's working on you. If you're getting any therapists working on you, make sure that they're always doing work on the hips too. Number 4, the fourth thing, structural thing that I commonly see related with hip alignment and hip issues is plantar fasciitis. So this is all the way down in your foot. So there's a lot of times for plantar fasciitis, people are like, okay, well, we got to roll out the bottom of your foot and we're going to stretch out your calf. And they put all the focus, basically from the knee down. I have found for most chronic cases of plantar fasciitis, you've got to start at the hips and go down because it goes all the way from there. When that one hip is rotated, it pulls that posterior chains to your hamstrings and your calves and puts tension all the way down. So you can keep working the end of the chain, but if the anchor is off, that plantar fasciitis is just going to keep coming back and keep coming back. So you need to work the whole thing. Again, this is more commonly especially if it's one-sided plantar fasciitis, and it's not because you did something to, I had a client once where it was clearly related to their foot because, they fell down the stairs and jammed their heel onto the floor. I'm talking about plantar fasciitis, especially if it comes up after you've been doing increased exercises, but it hasn't actually been high impact. That's another clear issue that is going to be related to the hips. So those are 4 things that can be related to your hip alignment and hip issues. So let's go. Let's review. You've got low back pain and SI pain, sciatic issues, knee pain, and plantar fasciitis can all tie back to the hips. And those are the most obvious of them. I've also seen neck and shoulder issues relate to the hips. So get the hips worked on. Now, what you need to do is that you want to incorporate into your exercise routine twice a week where you're doing something that's doing some work to strengthen the hips and to stretch the hips. But here's the thing for stretching the hips. The hips work in multiple ranges of motion. So you have to do things where your hips are being twisted, like a pigeon pose. You need to stretch out the front of your hips, like hip flexor stretches, like where you're going into the lunges. You need to stretch out the back of your hips, which means through the hamstring, and the inside, which means you're kind of stretching out the groin. So to get your hips released, you have to stretch all 4 sides of around that joint, inside, outside, front, back, the whole thing. The other thing that you really need to be aware of, and I've seen this quite a bit, where I'm checking someone's alignment when they're on the table. They're like, well, my alignment should be good. I literally just came from the chiropractor 2 days ago. And I check, and it's not even close. Is that you need to be aware of your own movement and positioning patterns. So if you're someone who's always sitting with one leg up, always sitting with one leg underneath yourself, always leaning to one side, you realize that when you drive, you're always leaning against the window. When you're sitting at your desk, you're always leaning to the right on your mouse arm. Or even pay attention to the way you walk. Sometimes this is a little bit more involved, but after you get out of the shower, just take a quick walk on the floor while your feet are wet and see if one stride is longer or shorter than the other, and then just try and be aware of trying to correct that to make sure you're stepping a little further. It's these little patterns that are off because of an alignment issue, but then it becomes a pattern, and then that reinforces that alignment issue. So be aware of your positions, and that will make it so when you do get treatments, they last longer. I would also say this. When you get a treatment, if someone just puts you back in alignment, it's just like pop, you're back in alignment, if you don't get the muscles stretched out and the right muscles strengthened, even if you correct those patterns, it's going to pull itself right back out. So you have to work on the muscles, the fascia, the alignment all together. So I hope this information was helpful, and I hope it reinforces the idea of how important your hips are when it comes to your structural health. This is Doc Yates signing off.
Thank you for tuning in to the Paramenobliss podcast. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and visit paramenobliss.com for more valuable information on how you can thrive during your transition through perimenopause. Join our community of like-minded women who are dedicated to achieving optimal health naturally, and stay up to date with the latest tips, tricks, and advice from Dr. Seth Yates. And we'll catch you on the next episode of the Paramenobliss podcast.